Welcome. Welcome, everyone. Please come and sit down. Please come in and sit down. We're going to start this session now. We've started some live streaming, so welcome. My name is Sally Lehrman. I'm founder and CEO of the Trust Project. And as the name implies, what we do is work on building a more trusted and trustworthy press. And at this conference, there have been speakers on trust and on transparency and on disinformation. In this session, you'll hear from two experts who will bring these concepts together for us and focus on effective interventions. So we'd like to look at ways in which disinformation is planted and how it gets distributed. We'll address the ways in which news organizations, journalists, get enrolled in adopting and spreading certain frameworks and certain terminology, and how we can get captured, in a sense, and what we can do about it. So disinformation often targets groups that are minority in number or disenfranchised in some other way, and so that is really where we want to highlight our attention today. It harnesses language and framing to sow division, to sow hate, and thereby undermine societal institutions and our social cohesion. So I'd like to introduce two people who I feel have great insights to help us better understand this problem and look at solution. So Adeline Hulin, who leads the UNESCO Communication and Information sector, and Ginny Badanes, I'm sorry, I've been practicing names and I always get it wrong, Senior Director for Democracy Forward at Microsoft. And I thought it would be best for them just to tell you what it is that the work they do around the world in this area. So please go ahead. Why don't you start, Adeline?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much. Welcome here, and it's really great to be, for me, for the first time in Perugia. So I'm working for UNESCO for the communication and information sector. And for those who don't know, UNESCO is the UN global organization with the mandate to promote and protect freedom of expression. I've been working there for around 10 years. And before I worked for the OSCE, for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And I was mainly working on issues related to media accountability and building trust in media. At UNESCO right now, I'm based in Brussels, so I've been following very closely the work, the policy work of the European Union in relation to disinformation, hate speech. The EU has been very active over the past years, as you probably know, with the Digital Services Act, but right now also with the European Media Freedom Act. And I'm also in charge right now of implementing one global project, which I think is going to be very interesting to present some of the main findings. The project is called Social Media for Peace, and it's a project that is about building resilience of people to hate speech and disinformation in conflict-prone environment. I just want also maybe if I can just say a few words about what we've been doing at UNESCO overall to address the issue of the having a healthy information ecosystem. This is something that has been now at the heart of our work for the past 10 years. We've been, since 3 years now, we've had all our member states that have adopted a declaration that is called the WINDOC Declaration that recognizes information to be a public good. And also it defines some priorities for our work to actually improve this information ecosystem. And the three pillars to work on that is pillar one is about working and ensuring media viability. As you know, this is serious concerns as the financial crisis has severely hit media. The second one is to work on media and information literacy and increase the critical thinking of citizens to address and be resilient to disinformation and hate speech. And the last one is about working on transparency and accountability of platforms, of digital platforms. And this is something where we've really increased our work, especially this year. We've launched in last year and at the beginning of the year some global consultations for developing some guidelines for platforms regulation that would be consistent with human rights and with the protection of freedom of expression, and also to ensure access to information. And we are about to launch actually the third version of the guidelines to be now discussed, I think, at the World Press Freedom Day, which is very soon.
Thank you. Please go ahead, Ginny.
Great. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Color coordination was not planned, but I take it as a good sign that we're going to have a great panel today. So I'm at Microsoft, and I lead a program called Democracy Forward. We have a few different projects that we work on, including a lot of efforts around protecting democratic institutions from cyber-enabled threats. So that's a little bit more on the cybersecurity side. But we also have a program around the information ecosystem. And basically the challenge that we've decided to undertake is what can a technology company, obviously specifically us, do about the information ecosystem and how can we make it healthier? And so as we look at it from that angle, that means a lot of different things. It means a lot of work around disinformation defense, both on our own products, making sure we're aligned in principles. You know, Microsoft has a whole variety of products where information integrity issues matter. But they have very different customer bases and they're run really uniquely. And so one thing that we have done is created a set of principles, our information integrity principles that guide the whole company. And so each of the product teams have signed on to these principles around things like freedom of expression being crucial to how we operate, as well as not monetizing disinformation, particularly that comes from foreign governments. Anyways, there's a series of principles that we've all aligned to as a company saying these are important to us and how we're going to behave and interact in this community. But another area of that as we look at the challenges facing the information ecosystem is, of course, the challenges facing journalism. And frankly, an awareness that technology has been a little bit of a problem when it comes to the viability of the media ecosystem, particularly when it comes to the business model. And so we've been investing in local pilots, particularly in the US, that we're expanding this work globally, trying to see what might work when it comes to reinventing the business model. I think we all agree we're not going to go back. You can't go back in time and create a time that once was. Everything has changed. But there are ways that I think the media ecosystem can create new business models, and we think that technology companies should be a part of that. We also think there's a role for philanthropy and local community support, and so that's a lot of the work that we've been investing in as well. We just recently announced a partnership between USAID and Internews around building a media viability accelerator, which if you're interested, you can go to Internews' website. They actually have a sign-up form where if you're a media organization, you can sign up to learn more and then be part of the actual accelerator once it's built. But that's where we think we're really taking sort of the strengths of civil society, government, and private sector and working together on a truly collaborative project to build a database and a visualization tool that enables the media ecosystem around the world to understand what's working from a business model perspective. What are the trends that are performing well? Where are things regionally or by different markets going well? Where are their challenges? So that all of you can learn from one another in a way that still enables you to have sort of privacy, noting that you, of course, don't want to share vital information with your competitors, but we think it's one of those, rising tides lifts all ships kind of efforts. So we're really excited about it. We had an event in DC 2 weeks ago to kick it off where Samantha Power from USAID and Brad Smith from Microsoft had a really great conversation, which I think is online now, or it will be soon if it isn't, where you can see kind of how they're thinking about the importance of this work. Anyways, there's a lot more to be said here, and obviously I know we're going to be talking about trust, a lot of work we think about as well as around the sort of the literacy aspect of this work and what we can do to help create a more resilient society, because there's a sort of a demand problem in addition to a supply problem when we think about the challenges of disinformation, so we address that as well. But we'll get into the actual conversation today, but that's a little bit of the framing of where we're coming from it and how we're thinking about these challenges.
Great, thank you both. And as you can hear, both Microsoft and UNESCO are looking at this across multiple dimensions, which is really what we need to do collectively across our various perspectives and various entry points into this news ecosystem. So, Ginny, I'm going to ask you to continue a little bit and talk a bit about what are some concrete examples of disinformation networks that you've observed that target the general public, especially when it comes to creating fear of the other or creating an in-group that I feel more comfortable with, and thereby there is an other that results?
Well, this won't be surprising at all, but there are a lot of case studies that are coming out of what we're seeing obviously happen with Russia's information campaign regarding the war in Ukraine. I'm sure there are people in this room who could probably elaborate even beyond, but I'll just use one example that we spent quite a bit of time researching and working across the company to try and understand how a narrative took off, and it was the narrative of biolabs. And again, I'm sure many of you have this information or maybe even more detail. I'd love to talk to you about it. But one of the things that we did was we sort of said, okay, where did it start? And frankly, you have to go back to the 1980s to really look at how Russia first started around biolabs narratives, because this is something they did to scare the Indian population into thinking that the US was going to spread AIDS into their country by setting up a biolab there, which of course wasn't true. And that was spread through just regular ads and stories in newspapers. And so you can look back at this example and recognize that while things have changed, a lot of things have stayed the same, because some well-meaning journalists wrote some articles that they believed to be accurate and true based on sources they were given, that then spread this narrative out. Modern day, what we saw Russia do in this particular case is they started with a expat, a former U.S. citizen living in Moscow who had a radio show, who had essentially created I don't know if it was a YouTube, but created a clip that was talking about, did you know that there are biolabs in Ukraine funded by the United States? But he posted that in like November, well before the invasion, well before the war. It didn't get any attention. It didn't really get that many views or clicks. But on February 24th, obviously the day of the invasion, all of a sudden a bunch of well-known Russian media sites started to amplify this unknown clip of this individual saying this information. And then we were able to see through the data information that we've gathered, what looked to be a pretty coordinated attempt to take those known Russian media sites and less known sites that have funding or connections to the Russian government started to amplify it. And so now we had something like 400 different sites amplifying this narrative. And then if you look about a month later, it starts to be a story that is around the world in some trusted newspapers, because they had seen so much volume on this story and had tried to understand it and were reporting out on it. And so what started with a very concerted effort by the Russian government to spread a narrative about biolabs by the US in Ukraine all of a sudden became a story that a lot of well-meaning journalists felt like they had to cover because it was everywhere. And what is this story, and is there truth to this? So that's just an example of how we can all sort of be manipulated through a very controlled and concerted plan. There are obviously a million other examples and maybe even some better ones, but that's the first that comes to mind for me.
Yeah, and that's a very good one, and we can see, as you said, many others being proliferated. What about from Microsoft's perspective? Is there something, like at what point can you intervene or do you intervene?
There's a lot of great work happening around identifying narratives early and trying to pre-bunk them. I think that with the war in Ukraine, we've seen that successful in some cases. In fact, even with this biolabs narrative, I do think that the pushback from the US government and from others was pretty swift in a way that while it took off from an exposure perspective, it didn't stick. I'm sure there were people who still believe it, but it didn't become what maybe it could have. So this idea that indications early of a narrative given to the right people who at the right time can share about it, that seems to have some level of success. It has to be used judiciously. And of course, there's always the challenge of, do you accidentally give oxygen to something that wasn't going to take off by talking about it? And that's a really hard balance, I think, to identify. But from Microsoft's perspective, we're working on finding those narratives early and sharing them with partners and others, just sometimes in public reports, sometimes in conversations, just to sort of say, here's what we're seeing through our data and indications of, particularly when we have these sort of known sites that are starting to spread this story, and particularly to certain communities, as you were mentioning before. One of our biggest areas of concern is frankly, the amount of, what's the word I'm looking for? The way that the Russians, particularly RT, have made their way into Spanish-speaking populations in both Latin America and the US as well. the extent to which that is viewed as a trusted platform for news is really, really concerning. And we see particular narratives being directed at those audiences and taking hold. So there's still a lot of solutioning here of how do we get to those communities and try and pre-bunk or create better narratives around what's happening. But that's one area where I think data can help us at least figure out what's happening, and then we need to figure out a path forward. And that's not just for one company. Obviously, that's going to be a whole of society response kind of thing.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, I want to recommend to the audience the reports that Microsoft does put out. I think they're very useful and kind of broad-based, so you can see how patterns are forming around the world. It's very helpful. Adeline, from your perspective, from UNESCO's perspective, can you offer some examples of some of the most dangerous disinformation that you've observed, really designed to create fear and division?
Yeah, I can actually use quite a few examples, or at least refer to what we're doing as part of the project Social Media for Peace, that really shows the strong interconnection between disinformation and hate speech. So as part of this project, I just mentioned at the beginning that the objective is to build resilience of people to disinformation and hate speech, and we are piloting it in 4 very different geographical, cultural contexts to actually see if there are big disparities in terms of the circulation of those content and how this is being addressed. The countries where we've been working are Bosnia and Herzegovina, Colombia, Kenya, and Indonesia. So as you can see, like really big diversity geographically, culturally, politically. And the first year, we've been really focused on making some surveys about the root causes, the impact and scale of hate speech and disinformation in the country, and at the same time, trying to see what are the tools that the platforms are putting in place in order to address the issue, what are the gaps locally, and what are the governments, what are the regulations that are in place. And when it comes to the results on the research part, on the scale and impact, we did quite a few, many actually, consultation with conflict-affected community, vulnerable groups, minorities in each of the countries. And the results are, of course, it shows the importance of taking into consideration the local context when we speak about those issues. But what it shows is that in majority of cases, more than 50%, hate speech and disinformation in this context is addressing minorities and vulnerable groups. So they are different from one country to the other. So in Indonesia, for instance, there are a lot of disinformation and hate speech against religious groups, religious minorities, sexual minorities. You would have a different, of course, context in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where a lot of disinformation is about the different ethnic groups. When it comes to a country like Colombia, we don't have yet all the results, but a lot is about, for instance, Venezuelan migrants, refugees. So it's really different, and it's really important to understand that there is this connection between disinformation and hate speech. The other thing is also when we then analyze what are the tools that are in place in order to address the issue, what have the platforms done locally? We've seen that there are huge disparities and inequalities, and that a lot of the problems are related to the fact that tools that platforms are putting in place are not working in those local contexts, or they are actually not investing in those small markets. Just to give you a few examples, in Kenya, it's a country with 60 languages, and actually most of the hate speech and disinformation is targeting minorities that are actually speaking not the 2 languages that are actually moderated. Platforms are only moderating in English and Swahili. So you have more than 50 languages that are absolutely not looked at. So of course, this is creating a lot of issues, because if you think that a lot of hate speech and disinformation is actually circulating about those minorities talking those languages. Another example is, for instance, from Bosnia and Herzegovina. We've seen, for instance, that for the whole country, you have one fact checker that is actually belonging to the ICFN network. So imagine what it means in terms of they are the only one actually being able to address the issue in the country, for debunking and checking in Serbo-Croatian. And this is creating as well a lot of tension actually with the media community. So there are really like tensions between the media there, and that's another aspect that is actually important to speak about. And not to mention that, for instance, in a country like Bosnia and Herzegovina, there is zero presence of any representative of any platforms, no any sorts of dialogue possible. So there is a huge frustration. Communities are feeling really powerless about how they can actually improve the situation, address the issue. So one of the things that we've been doing is, right now what we're piloting, we're just entering the second year, so we don't have yet a lot of results to share, unfortunately, but we're trying to establish national multi-stakeholder coalition with the different CSOs and representation not only of the, but on any kind of communities, and to try to bridge a dialogue between civil society, governments, and the platforms. There are two things I just want to add as well, is that some of the vulnerable groups that are systematically identified in each of the countries actually are the journalists themselves. And they are there, and it's, again, the same rhetoric is also like the division, creating them against them and foment division, and that it's a lot, we see an increase of this hate speech and disinformation in times of election. But this is creating a climate, of course, of intimidation. We see that because you were asking me what we see as very worrying, but that in many of the countries we see some real-world consequences and violences, and that's actually exactly the objective of the project, is precisely to prevent that, or to try to prevent that.
Well, and I think it's really important that you mentioned this whole dynamic of journalists being targeted as well. And we're targeted, and many people in this room know that have been the targets of disinformation, were directly being attacked. There's also ways in which disinformation happens at a more subtle level, in which journalists are targeted as the voices to become the voices of disinformation, to become the voices that, instead of bringing people together, which I think is often our purpose, instead is sort of pushes, building ways in our terminology and our framing that end up supporting division. So we've been talking at a very high level. When it gets down to each person's beat, to your area of coverage, I think often we think, well, there's the story about disinformation as opposed to the story that infiltrates our own story. And I spoke yesterday with Sasha Havlicek at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue in the UK, and this is one of the things they look at. And she was emphasizing, and just as you've heard, that disinformation is this coordinated set of deceptive activities and they seek to influence at every level. And so that means, I just heard yesterday someone saying, well, for local news, does this even matter? Well, in fact, it very much does. If you think about the terminology and framing that has shifted in coverage areas like migration, climate, sexual reproductive health, gender, it has shifted over time in ways that support certain agendas, and that's all being done deliberately. So as the terminology is shifted, then it makes it more difficult to have a dialogue across difference. So I wanted to just ask our panelists a little bit of where do you see that happening, and in what areas specifically? Go ahead, Ginny.
I think that one died. So one of the things when you were just talking that hit me when you said, does this affect local news? And apologies for the very US-centric reference here, but obviously there was a lot of disinformation about our elections. And you know, the Trust Project and this panel is about trust. And what sort of was unfortunate among many things that were unfortunate about the disinformation that spread around that was that the trusted voices, the people who should have been listened to, the election officials at the local level, were drowned out by other voices that were not at the local level, that were coming from different positions where they had their own motives for the information that they were sharing that was not accurate. What I'd love to see is, I know there's some great partnerships around this, is more partnerships between local news and the local officials that run whatever the thing is. In this case, I'm talking about elections, but I know this applies in other ways as well. And I know there's some groups doing great work on this, so not suggesting I'm inventing something here. But that's where I think you can see the sort of the defense against disinformation making its way into local news or into journalism is when the trusted voice, the voice that should be the authority, is listened to and trusted. Unfortunately, we're dealing with a reduction in trust across pretty much every institution around the world. It's at the government level. I think you all know it's at the news level as well. One area that it sort of is maintaining is actually within the business community. I don't know how long that will last, but for right now, the business community is actually remaining trusted. It's one of the reasons we actually joined up with CSIS around what's called the Civics at Work pledge. And Microsoft was the original signer behind that because we acknowledge that people are looking to companies for information where I would say they should be looking at local levels and institutions, but they're not. They're trusting companies. And so we have an obligation with that trust to try and share information accurately. So we do a lot around civics education and civics literature to both our employees and our customers, because we're just acknowledging that we are a trusted voice, particularly among our employees. That's another thing that the studies have found is that people trust the business community more than other institutions, but they trust their own employer more than other businesses. And so we have an obligation to our employees, particularly being a large business with as many as that we have.
And Adeline, where do you see the media getting captured, in a sense, by this disinformation?
Before I answer and just going back to the issue of trust generally, I think, so we keep talking about declining trust in media and the fact that, of course, this is one of really like a very serious issue. I think what we are trying to do at UNESCO is to look at this issue in a holistic manner and the fact that there are very many different reasons why there is declining trust in media. And part of the issue is on one side actually related to the fact that a lot of the problems are external to the media and everything is kind of interconnected. So we're looking at the media being captured as well in the sense that that they're now mostly relying on for their distribution on digital platforms, and the fact that there are many surveys that actually show that disinformation and hate speech spreads 7 times, or I think this is in the words of Maria Ressa, that they spread 7 times faster than truth. So relying on those algorithms is, of course, creating a lot of issues. But one issue I also wanted to say is that not only it creates problems when it comes to the prioritization of public interest information, but there are also, we have seen a lot of cases of journalists that are self-censoring themselves in order to avoid being blocked from the platforms because of reporting, actually, I mean, which is very cynic, on issues of hate speech and disinformation. So, typical example, we have collected a lot of testimonies from journalists in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where actually they are not being able, I mean, I'm saying I don't want to generalize, but some are having issues just reporting and disseminating some information about war crimes, judgments, because actually, as soon as they are doing this, they're being blocked from the platform. So these are really also like reporting on disinformation and hate speech, because the technology is being used to actually pick the words are not very efficient in servo creation, and therefore it doesn't make the distinction between reporting about it or actually spreading it. So this is again like one issue for when we talk about media being captured. But I think on the other side, having worked for so many years before this project on issues related to building trust in media, I think it's also very important indeed to be aware of some of the issues that are related to ethics, professional standards within the newsrooms. And here, issues that would be more internal to the media. A lot of issues we see are related to the fact that because of the financial crisis, media are relying extremely on freelancers that are not sufficiently trained on ethical standards and professional standards. And then also what we see as a trend is the lack of sufficient guidance for journalists when it comes to their work in the digital age, for instance. So There are a lot of questions that are being raised. I was working many years with press and media councils, and it took a lot of time for them to adopt new guidelines about how to work in the digital age. So can a journalist have a personal account on Twitter, on Facebook, on social media? Should it be transparent? How to report on these things? And actually, a lot of journalists are looking for more standards and more guidance. Just 2 days ago, I was in a workshop and dialogue with the Media Commission from Ukraine and the press councils in Georgia. And what they were saying is that they have received much less complaints from citizens about breach of ethics, obviously because of the conflict, but what they've received is an increasing number of requests from the journalists within the countries about they need guidance. They're saying, like, they don't know how can we do the proper reporting, committing to professional standards while at the same time respecting the martial law? How should we report about deaths? How should we report about war crimes, like the deaths during the conflict, etc.? So they have issues list of guidelines and recommendations for the journalists. It has been now the biggest focus of their work. But I think much more needs to be done when we speak about trust in media and actually how to improve the accountability and the standards of the profession.
Yeah, thank you for that. And with the Trust Project, we work with news organizations globally, and we do find that same phenomenon that people are really looking toward updating their guidelines to really fit with what's happening in the world now and the digital systems in which they're working, and also benefiting a lot from international communication across those standards. And there is a strong link with trust, with building trust, and I do want to come back to that. Before, I do want to make sure that we address this question of what's happening now with the large language AI models, because you were talking about the algorithms, Adeline. Now we have these large language AI models and Microsoft on Edge, Search, and elsewhere, which seem to give disinformation a power burst. We've been talking about, well, what's the ways that journalists can use these, but at the same time, they are a real opportunity for disinformation to accelerate disinformation. And we've seen examples in places where ChatGPT, for instance, upon a user's request, created articles or answers that supposedly relied on stories from The Guardian and The Washington Post, and there are people here from those organizations who could tell this story better, but those stories were completely made up. So the reference was a news story, purportedly, from highly reliable news organizations. In both cases, they did not exist, and in at least one of the cases, it was had harmful content to an individual. So I wanted to ask you, Ginny, why did Microsoft go ahead with the release, even there's so much unknowns about this right now, and how are you planning to address its likely use as a propellant for disinformation?
Sure, thanks for the question. So I think one place to start is to acknowledge there's definitely an explosion happening right now in the use of large language models in products. And a lot of these products have different use cases or purposes. When it comes to ChatGPT, Sam Altman and OpenAI are pretty clear that they don't intend for that to be used as a search engine. And so to be, proceed with caution when using it. I know they're also concerned about the hallucinations that are occurring, and they're spending a lot of time working to resolve that. The way that we view the Bing Chat API or AI model, which does leverage GPT-4, but also includes the Bing index, it is intended to be used more like a search engine. We actually think it is likely the future of how we will all use search. And it did not, though it appears to have come out of nowhere, it actually reflects lots and lots of years of work. In fact, we established our responsible AI principles several years ago, and the build of both the Bing Chat AI as well as other features have been relying heavily on those principles. So this was not a case of this is where everything is going and we need to put something out really fast. We recognize that's how it looks, and we definitely look back at how we could have communicated better our intentions earlier on. But this has reflected years of work. In fact, our team was fortunate to have been brought in, the tent, as we call it, fairly early on to help Red Team and think through what might happen if someone were trying to use Bing to create disinformation, and how easy would that be? What if people were trying to get it to say something that showed political bias? How easy would that be? So we spent quite a bit of time testing the system along with a lot of other teams to try and identify the things that might cause that, and the engineering team was very quick to make adjustments. We're proud with what we have out there right now with Bing, but I'm not going to suggest it's perfect. We know that there's still a lot to learn, but that is where we really did need to open it up more broadly for other users to really understand how it can be used. One thing that I'm really proud of the way that we've handled it in particular is the inclusion of citations. And so most of the other chatbots that you see do not have citations included. I'm sure that's the direction everyone's going, because it's important to know the source of the information that originated from. And that's important for publishers too, because we recognize, we talk about the adjustment to search and where search is going in the future. We know publishers get a large majority of their traffic in most cases from search, from links. And we do not want to remove that from the ecosystem. In fact, we want to find ways to work together to actually create a new revenue opportunity using the new search. So you'll see that there are blue links included in the Bing AI results, and we're going to be announcing soon additional features for publishers to actually drive more traffic back to your sites. So we're thinking about it both from how might this be used in the disinformation space, which I know is the original question, but just because I'm addressing a group of journalists and publishers, want to acknowledge that we are aware of the concerns. We're listening to the feedback. Feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to talk to you. But we also think that this is an opportunity to work together to find new revenue opportunities for this industry, because this is where search is going. So let's do this together. Let's build it in a way that it helps the business model. We do not want to go in and destroy your business model. We want to work with you.
Well, thank you for that. And this is my worry that, I mean, it's great that you're developing things like citations, but let's make sure the citations aren't hallucinations, as in those two examples. So
Can I just add real quick,
I know that wasn't your product.
Well, I was just going to say that's one of the advantages of including the Bing index, is that we're actually looking for real news in those cases. I'm not saying that Bing has never made anything up. We've seen it make some mistakes. We've seen it fall in love with reporters. We've worked on that. But for the most part, we do think we have an advantage by including the Bing results.
Well, great. Yes. And I want to open up to questions in a minute, but first I just want to make sure that we don't leave the room feeling depressed, because when I think too much about disinformation, then I do start to get depressed. And one of the things that's helped me think about the potential for change here is that we, at the Trust Project, we do a lot of user research globally, and we talk with people about what do they value in the news, how do they decide whether to trust it. So what are the signals that they look for? And then we marry that with journalistic values. And we continue to ask those questions. And we also were able to, across interviews in Europe and the US and other parts of the world, we were able to find about 4 different user groups that ran from the avid group who's like cross-checking the news, probably people like you in the room, and people on the other end who are completely disengaged, or maybe now disengaged with the wrong things, with disinformation. And then there's 2 middle groups, one that's more kind of regularly subscribing or looking at news, and others that used to just pay attention when the news essentially dropped on them. Now everyone is more interested in news and finding out what's going on in the world so they can make decisions, you know, about their own lives, all the way to civic decision making. What came out in our most recent study was a lot of anxiety, and it wasn't just us, others have found this too. There's a lot of anxiety about what's in the news. It's upsetting, we all know that. Anxiety, though, also about disinformation. People are aware of the problem and they don't want to get fooled, as they said. Well, there's also a lot of anxiety about becoming part of the problem. And so that anxiety is something that disinformation bad actors can grab onto, but it's also an opportunity for journalists. So it's a place in which we can intervene and say, we can help you, we can be that traditional guide that journalism is to trustworthy information. And so that's why the standards that Adeline was talking about are so important, is making those standards and sharing them out to the world. Also, Ginny was talking about news literacy and news fluency campaigns and how those can be helpful. We did one supported by Microsoft, and RTDNA was part of that, the Radio and Television Digital News Association, and University of Washington had 2 groups involved. And there were ads on Microsoft Surfaces that pointed people to these 8 trust indicators that news organizations share about who and what is behind their news story. It's things like explain what is the agenda of this news organization. It's to serve the public interest, or separating news from opinion. And when people knew about those 8 things and used them and became aware of them, a little survey that we had on our website, 60% reported a stronger sense of their own ability to separate news with integrity from all this other information out there. So to me, that's an opportunity. And do either of you want to say a little bit more about news literacy? Are you doing efforts in the news literacy area, Adeline?
Yes, we have been actually working at UNESCO. We are leading the work globally on promoting media and information literacy, and doing this quite a lot within schoolrooms. I was working on a project recently where we were piloting media information literacy within schools. It's a long endeavor because it's about, first of all, we did piloting, for instance, in 30 schools in Albania over the past 3 years. And this included first working on the revision of the curricula within school, but then also deciding what's your strategy when you do MIL, what are the type of audiences and pupils and schools that you want to work with. Is it more, do you want to do it at a transversal level, or is it which level at schools? Also, do you do it as part of, with the librarian? So there are different ways of working with media information literacy. And then teaching and training teachers, and then eventually, but we were able to actually, as you say, very positive results in terms of when you do this type of exercise with kids within school, you really see a difference afterwards with focus group about how they are being able actually to debunk disinformation, to recognize and to look at the right indicators in order to be able to trust information. So yeah, we have been very active in this area. And also another area where we've been working is indeed also piloting some work within newsrooms. So this is a bit different in order to improve transparency. And again, also trying to develop sometimes some labels so that actually people also are being able to recognize what is a media that is, for instance, belonging to a press and media council, so that actually the users know in case they disagree or there is a breach of ethical standards, they are able to complain. I mean, not like on social media, there is an accountability mechanism. Also piloting some transparency audits within newsrooms so that media would be more transparent. And I don't want to end on too much of a negative points, but still we've learned quite a few things. When you work on transparency with media, what media are requiring and they are asking for, they want to see more reward system and incentives for them to actually abide to that. So this is one area where we are working on. And then sometimes we've also seen and been learning that for some media, it can also be tricky for them to be more transparent. So this is a lesson, for instance, just to say on the transparency part, when we worked with some media outlets, for instance, in Turkey, doing transparency audits, many of them were saying actually for them it's counterproductive to be transparent about their sources of financing because they're extremely relying on external donor funding. And then this creates more distrust than anything else, that actually by disclosing who the donors are.
Well, and I think that we could have a whole other panel about that, because we do a lot of work in the area of transparency and building trust and working with news organizations, and in fact find that there are financial benefits and audience loyalty building benefits that you can gain. And yes, we have news organizations that worry about, well, too much transparency could hurt us. Initially, people didn't even want to show their ethics policy, but it all gets down to building that relationship with the audience and how you do it. And I want to make sure we have time for questions. So Ginny, I'm going to skip your answer. Maybe you can work it in. But let's go ahead and open up some questions. I see one in the front already. right here in the front. I don't know, is there someone bringing around mics? Yes, could you come on up? There's a person right up at the very front row, and then we'll, oops.
I'm from a Portuguese newspaper, Público. We have a editorial line quite similar to the Guardian and the El País, and we are. I'm also in charge of our fact-checking and disinformation program. One of the things that we actually are worried about is how to treat misinformation and hate speech. At one hand, we as journalists, we couldn't be stopped. We shouldn't be quiet. But at the other hand, when we publish anything about disinformation, sometimes we are giving more visibility to those articles instead of educating people and our readers to hit. So it's actually a constant fight, because when I propose an article and I say to my colleagues, we should write about it, this is misinformation. Some of my colleagues, they say, if we publish it, we will give more visibility to them. So what is the right balance in this fight? Thank you very much.
It's a really good question, because this is something that comes up very often. Indeed, if you give publicity to disinformation, is it raising it or is it actually debunking and helping? I don't have as you, I think I don't have the proper answer to that. I think I think it's really like important for media to do the fact-checking roles and to be, because right now what we see that there has been also like a lot of, not everywhere, but the fact that platforms are relying on these international fact-checking networks to actually work on disinformation online has also created a lot of distrust with the media, that why media themselves are not being able to do that. So I believe actually that one of the solutions is that fact-checking and fact-checkers was anyway the role of the media, and that this should be done by media. So in my opinion, it would be still like relevant to have media doing that work. I don't know if...
Just quick comment. The research I've seen indicates that if you repeat disinformation, people start to believe it, even if they don't believe it. Just hearing something over and over again, it starts to seem more likely and more believable. So I think the best way, from what I understand, again, this is based on academic research, is to try and state the accurate without restating the inaccurate. So wherever possible, to say this is what is true without giving a lot of airtime to this is what is false, that can be approached. Of course, it depends on the circumstances and the situation, but...
And the other thing is collectively, and this was one of the things that Sasha Havlicek was saying to me, was if we can get ahead of it as journalists, so to try to be less reactive overall, because when we're always reacting to misinformation, hate speech, then we are giving it oxygen. If we can try to, at the beginning, or throughout our coverage, build understanding, build awareness of not just the truth, but what different peoples that are often targeted by disinformation, who they are, what they're like, build a sense of connection across those groups. That will help deflate the disinformation as it comes in. So another question.
Hi, thank you. I'm from Slovenia. I'm an editor of an online newspaper for children, targeting children aged 6 to 15, basically. We are offering them news, which is part of media and information literacy and news literacy, but we are also doing workshops in schools. And my question is for Adeline. I was wondering, how do you measure, because you said that you saw the improvement of their knowledge. We are trying to develop our own measurement system, of course, with surveys and questionnaires. But it's very, we have heard in the past that it's very hard actually to measure this difference. So if you have any good ideas or tools that you could share with us, how to measure this, it would be really useful. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, I will give you maybe some links and contacts afterwards, because I have some colleagues that are still working on that, especially at HQ, but also in some regions. And they have actually developed as well. This was part of the work. It was from the beginning to start developing a methodologies about how you can actually measure the impact as much as you can. And I think this is about actually making sure before you start even doing these programs to already have some focus group, work with the teachers, what we've seen is, like, for instance, some teachers have entirely changed the way they are teaching. In some of the countries where we're working, it was vertical teaching, so like delivering, which you cannot do when you do media information literacy. So just about, like, so getting feedback from the teachers, but then also trying to get feedback from the pupils, like making sample survey about showing some disinformation and how they are reacting to it, and how they are actually questioning what are the first reactions. So I'm happy to share with you more. Yeah.
So a test, essentially. How about in the back there? I'm sorry, I didn't see you had the mic. Okay, please go ahead.
My name is Ben. I'm a neuroscientist from Stanford, and my question is, these efforts that you're leading, which are incredible, and I could tell there's a lot of interest from the journalism community. There's also a lot of concern in the scientific and medical communities about those topics and misinformation. So my question is, are those topics also a focus of your initiatives, and is there any way that concerned scientists or doctors can get involved and help out?
Yes and yes, but do you have any specific examples where scientists could get involved in your work, either one of you? Ginny, you probably already have scientists involved. Go ahead.
I might look to you. I wasn't expecting a neuroscientist. Sorry, I'm trying to adjust my mindset for that one. I think the short answer is yes. At Microsoft, we obviously have folks that focus on problems left to right, and then sometimes they focus on verticals. So our team definitely does think a lot about the disinformation challenges broadly. And so a lot of the solutions we put out are sort of regardless of the topic. In fact, we try to stay as far away as possible from the content itself. It's more about the actors, it's more about the impact on our users, it's more about societal resilience. So whether we're talking COVID or election disinformation, it's sort of there's no real difference in how we approach it. I'm sure there are people who are thinking a lot harder about the impact of AI on the health community and healthcare, both in the positives, but also what could be the negatives. I'm not that person, so it's hard for me to give you a good answer to that. But it's definitely an area of interest. It's where I think actually there's the most potential with AI, for what it's worth, is in the science community and particularly healthcare. But I don't have anything particularly helpful to say there. So I'll look to her.
Yeah, well, what should I say about that? I'm sure there is actually a lot of cooperation with the scientists, and especially even, I'm sure at UNESCO, we are the Organization for Science, Culture, Education, and we're trying not to work always in silo. And in many of the work, as we are doing, for instance, we are not trying to make more cooperation in our work when it comes to working on climate change and disinformation around it, and the importance of working with the scientist community. I would say that as a typical example.
Yeah, and for the trust projects, from our point of view, we were trying to address more disinformation about science, as well as what we can learn from neuroscientists and other kinds of scientists and social scientists about how these phenomena work. So I'd love to talk with you about that.
Maybe one thing that was...
Go ahead, and then maybe one more question.
No, but just to say about science, I think what we see, and that's for you, I guess, an issue of concern, is that when we speak about declining trust in media, we talk about declining trust overall in the society, including in the scientific community. So it's correlated.
Yeah, very important point. So I think we have time for one more. Yes, she's got the mic.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Phaedra. I work at a research center at McGill University called the Center for Media, Tech, and Democracy, and we've done a lot of work in this space as well, so I appreciate your remarks. I wanted to push back a little bit on the comment about the role of journalists in fact-checking. I think it's part of the piece, but I just wonder in a context of information ecosystems that are entirely separate, where there's a group of people that read one set or listen or watch one set of news outlets, and then there's another that listen and watch and read another. Like, if somebody is fact-checking something over here, but it's the people over here that believe it, like, how does that contribute to kind of improving the ecosystem? Thank you.
Thanks. Great question, because there is a lot of research kind of showing that there are some negatives around fact-checking. So go ahead, Adeline.
I get this refers to what I was saying earlier. I agree with you. I'm not saying that it's a black and white picture. Absolutely not. I was just trying to point out when I was here presenting some of the main issues we have seen, and the fact that It's probably not everywhere the same, and for instance, in a lot of the countries in Western Europe, the biggest fact-checkers are actually media outlets as well. But I'm just saying, like, in some of the countries where we're working, we end up in some division, because you have CSOs that actually, through various ways, manage to establish themselves as independent fact-checkers, you have the media community that stay aside from that trend, and this creates distrust. Because actually the fact-checkers are mainly fact-checking media and not necessarily the politician, and you end up in the situation of creating sometimes more distrust. So I just wanted to flag that, but of course I agree with you, it's not like black and white picture.
I'd say our philosophy tends to be, while there's a role for fact-checking in this space and it's important, we prefer actually the Trust Project's approach and the approach of others, which is looking at the publisher themselves and whether they adhere to journalistic principles. And that's a way of sort of saying neutral again on content, on what they're putting out, and it's saying, do they print corrections? Do they have transparency? I recognize that's challenging in some places, but do they have transparency in their funding? Are they following sort of what you would expect of your news provider? And you all might be surprised that some of the conservative in the US organizations that you might not agree with a lot of what they publish actually do quite well on those metrics. They might be telling things from a perspective that is disagreeable to others, but they're not pushing disinformation, right? They're telling stories that are accurate and follow journalistic principles, and so they would get a good score in that case. And we want to create an ecosystem where you hear various opinions and perspectives. And I think there is a tendency to move towards these filter bubbles, which is enhanced, we know, by technology and the way a lot of news is fed to people based on what platforms they might be using. And so I think looking more at the publisher and how trustworthy they are is a better way to approach it, not to take away from the necessity of fact-checking, because there's some ways that just needs to exist. But.
Yes, and one little tidbit of, again, positive news is that when these kinds of approaches where you're trying to make the audience more aware of how journalism works, they actually do reach the skeptics probably more than anyone else. So with that, thank you so much for being an incredible audience with great questions and an incredible panel. Please join me in thanking our two speakers.